instead of this miserable weather that we're. So that's great. Anyway, today we have Rick Surowicz, just a tremendous artist. I'm so impressed with, well, because he does a lot of things that I like to do, paint nature, and but he also has some unusual, to me, other kinds of not abstract, but very graphic looking paintings of cities, just beautiful pieces. I, however, like to see the nature and the spatters that he does. I hope he will talk a little bit about that while he's on. I like a statement that he had in the artist statement. He had a line that says, "I seek to portray that which is not obvious," and hopefully we all try to do that. But I love the things that he shows us. So without further ado, Rick, why don't you just take it? You're on.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, here you're fine.
Thank you.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for having me join you this evening. I know you guys have been in the news a lot with the snow. And,
Yeah.
I have a little bit coming myself tonight, but nothing near that. I think we're supposed to get, now it's 5 to 7 inches or so, but it's nothing near the multi-feet of snow that you've been getting. I'm kind of in a secondary snow belt, not the primary one out of Cleveland. So I'm about 30 miles south of Cleveland in Medina, Ohio. And again, thank you for having me. And before I start getting into a demonstration, I'm just going to show you a little bit about the types of paintings I like to do, how I like to paint, just to give you a little background on myself. So I like to work with transparent watercolors, and that's all I work in. And I like the challenges of working with transparent watercolor. And I always feel people should paint the way they enjoy painting and what they enjoy painting. And you know, there's nothing wrong with using opaque paints, gouache or inks or whatever, whatever works best for you. But myself, I like the challenges of transparent painting, and I like to paint with textures. And I'm going to kind of focus on textures tonight in my demonstration. I'll talk a little bit up front about textures, and then put it to work in a painting. I'm going to show you some of the paintings that, some examples of some of my work. Most of these are full sheet paintings, but I like to look at, if you look at this winter watercolor artist magazine, there's a segment they always have called Burning Question, and I was asked to contribute to that this time, and it's about painting in winter. And my take on the painting in winter is, I don't look for the pretty postcards as much as I like to paint the textures of winter and nature. And looking at vines and branches wrapped around the fence post, or briar bushes along a frozen river. And those are the types of things that attract me, and I like to paint. I like to, again, because I like to work transparently, I have to plan to maintain the lights and the whites in my painting, because I'm not using any opaque paint. So I'm using the white of the paper in all these. And then again, these are full sheet paintings. This one's a quarter sheet, but the splattering, the textures, and the snow on the branches are things that I enjoy working with and experimenting with. This is a full sheet. Just I like to look up. I like to take kind of unusual views of things. I like to zoom in on rocks and sticks and water that's flowing. And this is a full sheet of a river flowing out in Oregon. And again, to the right there in the bottom right-hand corner, same kind of techniques that I use with the snow to get the feeling of these twisted briar bushes and everything there. And a little snowy scene, splattering, masking fluid. Now, this is a full sheet painting. And it utilizes a lot of the techniques that I'm going to demonstrate in a much smaller scale this evening. I'll be working on a quarter sheet. This is another version of it. This is actually a painting that was just entered in, just got accepted into the AWS show that's coming up this year. It's a full sheet painting, and the techniques in this are the same as what I'll be using in a quarter sheet painting I'll be doing tonight. I live in kind of the Midwest here, where there's a lot of Amish areas, and a lot of farms, a lot of old barns, and I get attracted to painting some of those things. I like to zero in on some of the buildings, and again, you can see some of the textures and things that I like to work with. The other thing I like to do is work with negative painting, positive and negative space. So, this is an example where, I'm not working with necessarily local color, the actual colors of what I'm seeing, but I'm working with different color schemes, developing a value pattern, and working with positive and negative shapes and edge development. And again, this is a full sheet. This is a cityscape. These are some of the things I like to work with in terms of cityscapes. Here's another example. So this is a full sheet, and to maintain the lights and the whites on this, I do my drawing, and then I actually cover the whole sheet, which is 22 by 30 inches, with 2-inch clear packing tape, and I overlap it, and I cover the entire surface, and I take a knife and I cut a frisket out of that, and then I remove the tape that I don't want, and then I put a big wash that kind of ties it all together over the whole sheet, and then I dry it, I take off the masking, then I build up my values and shapes and work from there. So I enjoy, again, working with positive, negative space. Same thing here, same process, a full sheet. And a lot of glazing, building up of values. But again, positive and negative space. Same thing with flowers. I like to work, I'm as interested in what's going on behind the flower as what's going on in the flower. It drives me nuts when I see somebody post on Facebook, they've painted a flower and they're asking what they should do with the background, because you're designing the whole space, and the space in between the objects and the things that we see, the things, is just as important as the shape of an object itself. So the space between petals of flowers is just as important as the petals of flowers. The same thing with a person, people walking down the street. You have figures walking down the street, but there's also shapes in positive and negative space around those objects. So you design the whole paper. So you shouldn't just, if you're just painting a flower, then you're saying, hey, what should I paint behind it? You're not really designing the space. So again, like positive and negative, like lost and found edges. And to me, this is a fun way to paint. And this is a full sheet, but working with positive, negative, and these types of paints are just more imaginary than anything. And there's another one, working in some geometrics with some of the soft shapes and glazes, and working with some of the different colors. Again, that's a full sheet there. So those are just some examples of the types of paintings I like to do. For this evening, like I said, I want to focus on textures. So when we're talking texture, you have physical textures, but we're talking about visual textures on a two-dimensional surface. So there's perceived surface quality, the illusion of texture, an illusion of depth on a two-dimensional surface. It gives a tactile appearance to an otherwise two-dimensional surface, and it helps describe the characteristics of a subject. And texture is one of the elements of design: line, value, color, texture, shape, size, direction. For me, value is the most important element of design, but everybody tends to jump to color. And if you have a strong value structure, you can paint with mud. It doesn't matter what color you're painting with if you have a strong value structure. But if you don't have a strong value structure and you have wonderful colors, it's still not necessarily going to be a strong painting. But texture can add to those those other elements of design. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. And when we're talking texture, we're talking about 4 qualities: rough texture, smooth texture, soft, and hard. And the way I break it down myself is I look at it, there's additive techniques, subtractive techniques, and masking. And I'm going to demonstrate some of those techniques that I use in my paintings before I do the painting. So I'll expand on that a little bit. So some things to consider when you're talking about texture: it's particularly effective at edges, when in using the expected texture. So when you have like a building sitting in a field and there's this grassy, hay or straw around there, you don't see the hard lined bottom board. It's more of a softer landing. When something's sitting in water, it's a softer landing. And so those textures around the edges are very effective at really describing the qualities of what's going on there in the relationships. And think about scale when you're talking about texture. Sometimes people they'll incorporate a texture And as you're moving back in space, you're not scaling down your texture. You're using the same textures 200 foot away as you're using here in the foreground. And I'm big on looking at foreground, middle ground, background, and looking at value dominance in those, but looking at scaling things down to get depth in your painting. You can create a lot of visual interest with textures. You can use it to influence a focal point. And it's not, but the whole thing is, for me, it's not a replacement for a strong value plan. Sometimes, it's not uncommon to see where somebody will just try and go crazy with texture, thinking it's just going to cover, if they put enough texture down, it'll look, look wonderful. But, just putting a bunch of wood grain on something, and if it doesn't have the structure there, it's really not going to be that effective. So my setup for tonight is going to be this, and I'm going to be working with that painting there as a subject, and it's similar to those larger ones I was showing you. I'm going to use some of those techniques in that painting, but first I'm going to show you how I do some of those techniques and just go through them. And so, is there any questions? Is it okay to ask that, Carol, right now, or should I just go ahead?
Do you want to do that now, or do you want to wait till the end? How do you prefer?
I'm just asking at various stages if there's anything about what I just covered real quick, and then I'll move on.
If that's okay with you, they can unmute, or they can put their question in chat, and I can ask it of you.
Okay, however you want to do it. I'll get going there, and if there's any questions you want to bring them up, feel free to ask me in the flow of things. It doesn't bother me, or if we want to wait to the end, that's fine too. However you want to work at. So if you look at this and how I've laid this out, over here, these three columns, I have additive at the top. Over here, these two columns, I have subtractive, and here I have masking. So additive techniques, and I'm going to grab a 1/2-inch flat brush. So I feel sometimes flat brushes are underutilized. People just tend to use them like they're painting a wall. When I use a flat brush, I use the tip, I use the edge, I use the corner, I use the belly, I drag it, I push it, I touch it, whatever I can do to get the mark that I want out of it. And I'm going to be working with just a darker blue tone here for this. So much about watercolor too is knowing what to expect out of the behavior, under the various moisture conditions, moisture content, and loading of the brush. So these to me are additive techniques. So right now I'm going to take some of that moisture off. And just so you know, when I look at moisture and I'm thinking about moisture in my paper and my brush, I break it down myself into really 3 conditions of moisture. I look at what I call saturated, which is glossy. It has water on the surface. Damp, it's absorbed that surface moisture and it's more of a satin finish. And you have moisture in the paper, but you don't really have it floating on top as much. And that's really when you're mostly at risk for blossoms and backwash. And then dry, so saturated, damp, and dry. And then in terms of the brush, I kind of break it the same way. A saturated or loaded brush where it's got a bead on it, or damp where the bead is off of it, or more of a dry brush technique, where you're doing broken edge technique and everything. So that'd be helpful for you to have that background as I do some of these. So for this, I'm going to take this flat brush and make it more of a damp brush, and it's on dry paper. So this is going to be a dry paper column, a dry paper column, and a wet paper column. So if I drag my brush, that's damp on dry paper, I get a broken edge, and I'm just using it in a traditional brush stroke. But I can also take that and just, to me, a flat brush and the belly of a flat brush, and when I'm using it like this, I drag the belly, then I tip it up on the edge if I want a sharper edge, or the corner, and make a mark. To me, it's really good at making foliage on trees and making it a natural edge. Sometimes when you take a brush and you try and paint the edge of a tree, it looks like you took a brush and tried to paint the edge of a tree. And me dragging a brush around like this is more organic and more natural looking. You just have to control the moisture and let the medium do the work for you. And we're going to go down here. So that's with a flat brush. And I'm just going to take a number 8 round brush. And, I'm going to just show you, get similar results. So damp, oops, I took a little too much out of there. So damp brush again with a round brush. and drag it, and I can get similar marks. And then again, if I take it and just drag it around on the belly of the brush, and use the tip a little, and use the belly and push it and drag it, I can start to create various textures that are, and for me, it's good. It's a good technique for foliage. And you're not fiddling with a little brush trying to paint little leaves and things. You're just letting the medium work for you. So then I like to splatter. I like just the natural patterns that are created. So when I like splatter, what I do is usually load the brush. It's got a little bit in it. It doesn't have a really big bead, but there's quite a bit of moisture in it. I just tap it on my hand, and I rotate that around so that it doesn't just get all linear in the pattern it's being laid down in. But sometimes I want a linear pattern, but generally I rotate it around a little bit so it'll fill the space that I'm trying to fill. So that's with a round brush. The other thing, you could take like a toothbrush, splatter, you get a fine splatter, good technique. So these are all on dry. One that most people have used ever since they were in grade school is, a sponge, a coarse sponge, a fine sponge. If you look at all these different types of textures, there's different applications for any of those that you could use. And then you can also, let's see, I'm just going to take a 4.
Hey Siri.
Yeah.
Hey Siri.
But he's looking for Siri.
And is that a question? Or is this something okay, I'm just going to continue here. So you can make patterns, you can create texture, like, grassy shapes or something just by, using your brush. There's times when you want straight marks, patterns. So when I do a painting, and I'm going to go back here just a second. So I'm going to advance here a little bit. So this painting here, this is the one I was just saying it was in the NFWS, and I posted on Facebook recently. So one of the comments I get is, "Oh my gosh, I must, look at the detail. It's incredible." And, "Oh, it's taking you hours." And really, it's not detail. It's simplification. And this I'm really simplifying, because what I'm not doing is I'm not taking a photograph, or I'm not on location, and I'm not trying to render every stick and branch and piece of grass that I see in a photo. What I'm doing is trying to suggest the texture, suggest the pattern, suggest the values, and suggest the colors. And I'm using these various techniques to create them. But this is, again, it's a 22 by 30 inch full sheet painting. And I worked on it over the course of 2 days and probably put 6 hours worth of work into it. It's not a painting where I'm sitting there with a 000 brush and trying to paint blades of grass. I'm really simplifying. So, and sometimes being, simple is hard, but a lot of these shadows, that's on the wrong level. The shadows and things are big brush marks, just of some gray tones and violets and some blues and things, but they're quick brush strokes and then move on. It's not noodling away and rendering. So to me, it's actually, I'm simplifying, where some think I'm really, noodling out this realistic tech or detail, and I'm not. So so those are some dry textures and different ways to create various dry textures, and they can work in a number of ways. So here I'm going to work wet. And let's see, so I'm going to put some of this down here. So just let me, and I work on Lanaquarel, 140-pound cold press watercolor paper is what I work on. And I work at about a 20-degree angle. So I let gravity do some of the work for me. I'll wait for those two. So here, I use this little water bottle here, and I just barely push the button, and I'll spritz just a little bit of water into that, you know, and I can get a texture from doing that. I can also load my brush up with some water and tap it on my finger and splatter some water in there and create some texture. So when you put down a large wash over rocks and different things, that's a nice way to get some interesting texture in it by spritzing some water or tapping with some water in it. And actually, let's see, this one here, if I didn't wait I might have waited too long. Let's see, I'm going to tap some water into this, and there you can see, you know, I'm getting a pattern in there. And this one I'm going to splatter. Let's see. We'll go with a little different color here. It's going to cooperate. So I'll just splatter a little paint in there. So that's splattering paint, I'm getting it everywhere, but into to a wash that's already down. So it can give you an interesting pattern in that. The next one, and I'll use this technique in like sunflowers, the center of sunflower. Again, I don't want to paint, you know, 5,000 seeds of a sunflower, so I create the texture, the pattern with that. So for that, I don't do it that often. I only use this when I'm creating text. I don't like put paint on a paper and throw salt and say I'm creating a salt painting and see what I make out of it. I use it specifically to create a texture in a specific spot. So let's get a little bit of, and the thing about working with salt, you need to make sure that you have enough moisture. You have a fully loaded brush when you put that down, or it's not gonna work right. If it starts to dry and it's even damp, it needs to be saturated. It needs to have water on the surface. If it starts to dry, it's just gonna bounce right off. So this first one is gonna be coarse salt. The second one is going to be a fine salt. Actually, I got some of the coarse in there, but you can create different textures. So I'm going to mute my mic for a second while I dry this, and I'm going to lift off this salt. So it's in there while it's wet. And sometimes if I feel I didn't get it moist enough and I want to add a little water, I have this bottle that has a fine mist. I might hit it with it. But right now I'm going to mute, I'm going to dry this, I'm going to remove the salt. Okay, so that's dry. You can rub it off with a tissue or rub it off with your finger. But it's giving me different, actually, fairly fine texture in there with the coarse salt. But you can get different textures with that. And a situation where I would use that is, let's see if I can get this. Like the center of these sunflowers is done with the salt, and it's also done with spritzing and lifting off dry, which I'll show you in the subtractive column. But hopefully you can see how using that salt technique, how it can create that interesting texture that kind of gives a suggestion of seeds in the middle of a flower. So these are all what I consider additive techniques. I'm adding something to the surface. Here, I'm going to be removing something. So I put a wash down and now I'm going to remove. So I'll use this technique a lot in my florals. So actually, if you look at this one, I got a, all right, let me fix it. So if we look at I'm going to go to another one here to show it a little better. Let's see. If you look here, you see these kind of grassy shapes that are coming out. There's some dark ones, but there's also light ones that are in there. Probably some, like in here, these kind of grassy shapes that are overlapping. This next technique is how I generally get those. So I'll take a nylon brush. This is an angle shader. And so I take the bead off. I don't want a bead of water on there. It's damp and has a nice edge on it. So, I just blot it and I lift out. So that's when I'm using those florals, I take big sweeping strokes with that and I lift out and I blot it. And then sometimes as I'm putting glazed washes down, I'll strengthen the edge on some of those shapes that I make. And the other thing it can do is it can carry off of like an area that has pigment. It's light here, and then as it crosses over it, now it's dark on light. You can carry that over if you want and create, that continuous texture, and it goes from being a light shape on a dark surface to a darker shape on a light surface. So just using a damp brush. Another way would be like using an oiler bottle, or that one doesn't have much water in it. So this is a bottle I use for masking fluid, but I can do a little bit of, oops, this one isn't the best. But I can kind of draw, I got too much out of there on that. I can kind of draw with that and blot. This is the best example. My oiler works a little better usually. You can put dots down too, but you can draw and blot and remove textures and patterns and lines if you can get a narrower line. Mine is not cooperating, it has a drop coming out of that. This is a technique that I'll use sometimes too to get texture. Like this one where I spritzed water into a wet surface. If I spritz this, just barely get a little bit with my thumb, spritz that on a dry wash. Now I take my tissue and I just kind of strike it sideways a little bit. It'll lift out and give me a pattern in there. And I can also do the same with a brush, tapping this just to splash some water on there. Just let it sit a second and then lift out, and it can give me a similar texture to what the salt gives me. It's another way that sometimes I'll create texture in the center of something like a sunflower. This technique, I don't use that often. None of these are destroying the paper. They're just lifting out pigment or moving pigment. This one is actually is destroying paper. You can take the tip of a razor blade and you can scrape down to the paper. I rarely use this, but it is a way where you can remove the paint and a little bit of the paper and give you a fine line. That's not the technique that I generally use. So now I'm going to work again. This is subtractive on wet paper. So I'm going to put a wash down. I'll let that dry a little bit. So remember when I was talking about saturated paper, damp paper, and dry paper? Just as damp paper is the time you're most susceptible to blossoms and backwash, it's also the best time to scrape. So when it's glossy and has saturated, has water on the top, you scrape it, it just fills back in and it actually scars the paper, it leaves a dark scar. But if it's when it starts to get damp and just saturate or damp and it just has a satin sheen to it, it's a good time to scrape. And as I look at both these, they're pretty shiny. This one though, I'm going to do a little lifting with. So here I'm going to take, just as I lift it out of here with the dry, when it's dry and I came in with a damp brush, I'm going to come in with a fairly dry brush. I'm going to lift some out of here. It does the same basic thing as here, but it doesn't give quite as crisp an edge. So if you want like this type of a mark, and you can put a little moisture in your brush and make it damp, it'll help lift out. But if you want this type of a mark, but you want a little softer, you can do it when it's damp. Now this one is dry and quick. This is a narrow window when you can scrape. So it's a satin sheen for me. It's damp. And now it's the best time for me to scrape. And I'm actually pushing, I'm not scraping paper, I'm just pushing paint. And this is just a linear mark that I make and scraping in there. Now I'm going to go down and I'm going to make a broad scrape into this. Get a big enough area. While that's starting to dry a little bit, so I want it to get to a satin sheen. Here, you know, sometimes when I'm painting, I put a wash down, but it's too flat, too even. So I'll hit it with my hand, or I'll hit it with a tissue. So, you know, sometimes I use a tissue a lot. I either soften an edge, alter the wash, or I made a mark I don't like and I'm trying to blot it up. So here, if I just want to alter the wash a little bit, you know, if that's a tree trunk and I put a wash down, it looks too much like a big paint brush, I might just hit it with my hand or something and just alter the wash a little bit. So here's one where I get a big enough area. So this one I might come down, you know, I might just hit my hand in it and just alter the wash that I put down. I don't want just a flat, perfect wash. So now this is more of a satin sheen right now. So I'm going to make a broad scrape. So let's say I'm on this top of a rock. You know, this is good for, you know, making rocky surfaces. You can scratch, scrape, and I'm moving paint. I'm pushing paint around, and I do that when it's damp. So two columns of subtractive techniques on dry paper and wet paper. And then the last one is masking. And then I use this quite a bit to preserve the white of the paper and the texture. And I've already put some masking fluid on here and let it dry. So this one, and this one are all done with a toothbrush. And I rinse it in soapy water first and kind of knock the water out of it. Then I dip it in a jar that I have. You can squeeze it from a bottle, whatever works best. And then, you know, one technique is I pull back the bristles and I just let go and it splatters and it's a finer texture. And I rotate around as I was over here so it doesn't all go in one direction. It gives a general coverage. So that's one technique. The other one is, instead of pulling the bristles back, I'll tap it on my finger. And when I do that, I get bigger drops. So it makes a more coarse texture as opposed to just splattering it. And then sometimes I'll get very close and I'll pull back the bristles, if you can see. I'll get close to the surface and I'll just splatter them in one direction, like the edge of a pine tree or something, or an evergreen. If I want that feeling, that directional flow and texture of a branch hanging down off an evergreen, I might use something like that. And so those, if I remove those, I use a pickup eraser designed to actually do that. Just rub it off, and now it gives me that light texture. I'll use that in winter scenes to create kind of snow. I'll use it in summer scenes to create like a sparkle in the trees and everything. What I'll do is I'll paint on top of this, and I'll paint my trees, all my foliage, whatever I'm painting. And then I remove this, and then I'll glaze over it with like a yellow green or something like that, and it gives a little bit of a sparkle in the trees. So when I use these textures, I don't necessarily leave them always with white paper. Sometimes I glaze them, depends on what I'm trying to do there. And this is the one that was done by hitting the toothbrush on my hand and creates bigger drops. So splattering, hitting on my hand, and this is the directional one. So it gives the little impact, and then it's just splattering that way. The other thing I do a lot is I use, you can buy these fine line bottles here. They're about $12 or so. Last time I bought one, they clog pretty easily, and the replacement caps are expensive. So what I do, this is what I was taking to when I was doing the in-person workshops before a pandemic, I would take these to my workshops, but I buy these are quilling glue bottles you can get on Amazon. You can get the package I get has 15 bottles and 10 extra caps. So you have 25 tips for about $10. And then I fill it from a jar and basically make my own fine line masking. And if it clogs, I try to unclog it, but if it doesn't, I just throw away the cap and put another on, because I got 25 of them for $10. So that's what I use a lot to create textures. So here's one where I've taken this tip and I've created a cross hatch. Here's one where I'm just creating, grassy shapes and sticks and branches, and I use that a lot, and I'll be using that in the painting that I'm gonna do here in a second. So I wanted to take the time and just show you some of the techniques I use in my paintings. And like I say, the reason I work with these types of techniques is because I like to stay transparent and preserve the white of the paper rather than using opaque paint. It's just the way I like to paint, and I like the challenge. So before I jump into my painting, I don't know if there are any questions on anything I covered in here before I move on.
No, just a comment. That was really, really well done.
Good. All right, I'm gonna get a drink of water here. So, these are techniques that I use in some of those paintings I showed, and I'll use some of them tonight in this the painting I'm going to be working with, and I'm going to show you how I would approach it in this subject that's here in the top right corner.
Okay.
And
Hello, Rick.
and then I'm going to I have one I already have the masking fluid on. So as far as the masking fluid, like I do a lot of studio work. Most of my painting is in the studio, and I use a hairdryer frequently. And when I put the masking fluid on, I let it air dry, air cure, because I feel using a hairdryer at that point, I feel it affects the way it bonds to the paper. I may be right or wrong, I'm not sure, but it's my superstition. But once it's dry and cured, I use a hairdryer throughout the whole process. I don't have a problem. And one of the things I get asked in my classes a lot is how long can you leave masking fluid on? And I'm going to show you a painting here. I'll get to it here in a second. There it is. So this painting actually ended up being in Splash 21, and this is a full sheet painting, and I drew it out on my full sheet, had it mounted on my board, and I put the masking fluid on it. So you can see all the textures and everything. So there's a lot of masking fluid on it. And then I decided I was going to do a quarter sheet version of it. I wanted to try a few things. So I decided I was going to do a quarter sheet version. So I did that, and I set this aside. And then 6 months later, I decided I either needed to get it off my board or finish painting it. So I decided to finish painting it. I had no problem removing the masking fluid or anything. So 6 months may be unusual, but I don't see any problem with leaving. I haven't encountered myself any problem leaving masking fluid, at least the masking fluid and paper that I work with, for an extended period of time. So just FYI. I'm gonna
Rick,
yeah.
what type of masking fluid do you use?
So I use this here. It's called the Incredible White Mask Liquid Frisket, and it's actually made in Cleveland. And the only downside about this is, so I buy these large bottles, and I was using them a lot when I was doing in-person workshops. But it tends to, after a while, it can get kind of thick and yellow a little bit. That's after a while. I go through it enough that I don't really have much of a problem, but it does after it sits for a while. But it works pretty well for me. I've had a lot of luck. It's clear pretty much when it dries, so it's a little hard, like in classes and stuff, for people to see my masking fluid, but it works pretty well. I've seen some instances where the colored masking fluid stains the yellows and the oranges, and I try and stay away from that. I would think if you left that on for a while, it probably would stain the paper. So I'm gonna lighten my lines a little bit that I've drawn in here, and
I think people would probably like to know what you just used to run over your papers. The
this.
bag. Yeah.
So this is called a dry cleaning bag, or dry cleaning pad, I guess. They cost $5 or $6. They're an old drafting thing. I use it. They remove do a good job of lightening the lines if you want to lighten them, or removing excess graphite so you get graphite in your paper. If you push hard enough, it'll act like an eraser. So I do that sometimes when I think my lines are a little heavy, and I just brush that off. Okay, so if there's no questions, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you how I would approach masking this subject. And like I said, this is kind of a scaled down version of the bigger paintings that I was showing you, but it'll do a good job of illustrating the techniques I was talking about. Let me clean my paper or my palette. I use a ceramic palette, and my palettes are arranged where I have cool colors over here, warm colors over here. I usually mix warmer colors here, cooler colors here, and when I paint, I'm almost always working with warm and cool mixtures. So I usually incorporate both warm and cool in my paintings. And but I'm going to go ahead and this is working. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you kind of how I would approach something like this. I've got this kind of drawing out some basic shapes. There's some areas where a little larger kind of sapling type thing has some snow build up on it. So I just take my bottle and I'll put some of that on. It's pretty quick. The one thing about using these bottles, it really doesn't take a lot of pressure. Sometimes, what I hear is, I'm getting big globs and everything. How I describe it best is you just need light pressure to maintain a flow into the nozzle, and then it writes almost like a rolling writer. You don't need a force behind it to let it to feed out. If you just put light pressure on it and just draw along, it'll give a pretty fine line. And speed and feed kind of have an impact here, but if you squeeze it too hard, it's going to come out in big globs. And the other, one thing too, I always like to mention is, I'll use these like in the backdrop of woods to create all these tangles of briars and branches and everything. And I've used these in classes, this texture and this technique, and people are doing it. And the thing I remind people is the mark that you make that's what's going to show when you remove the masking fluid. So I've had people they'll go between trees and they're trying to make it look like branches, but they just start making little X's of masking fluid. And when you take it off, it looks like you have just a bunch of little X's. So when you put your masking fluid down, do it just like you would if you were painting it, because that's what's going to show. That's the mark that's going to show, or the shape that's going to show, if you are using the masking fluid. So I just, I kind of bring in the textures where I want. I'll have straight lines. I'll have curved lines. there'll be some kind of hooking in, more almost horizontal, some branches. And these types of things, you know, you want to make sure if something's going to be overlap that you make it look like it's going to be overlap. You lift off and you start on the other side and continue on, or you know, one shape on top of it, or the shape that you're masking is either going to go over or under. So you need to, you know, obviously consider that when you're putting your marks down and lift where you lift. So those full sheet paintings I was showing you, there's a lot of little textures in there, but this is how I approach it. This is why I'm saying I'm really simplifying. I'm trying to suggest what's there, but by creating textures and patterns and using value and color to describe it without really trying, like I said, I'm not trying to render it with a little brush. And, you know, you need to edit. When something's in your painting that's just not good design or in your subject, you know, you add, subtract, modify, whatever will give you the best result in your painting. So sometimes when I like to look at these kind of bottoms of trees along frozen rivers or creeks, or, you know, but a lot of times there's just an ugly branch that doesn't help your painting at all. There's no reason to put it in. So this just has a grassy shoreline, or a straw and some sticks and weeds and things growing up here. Bring them in from the side. I want to connect to the edges on all the sides. Get some straight marks in there, and you want to vary too. You don't want the spacing to be the same and the length to be the same on all the marks. You don't want to just picket fence what you're doing where everything's the same length, same width, same space. And too often we ignore what's going on in between things and the space in between. Like I said, that's just as important as the objects themselves. So that's probably enough. Actually, I'm going to bring a little bit down here. There's some branches that reach out. You know, not everybody likes to use masking fluid, which is fine. I always encourage people to paint the way they want to paint. The other thing that I think is really important is that you try to see the shapes and try to see the larger shapes. Stop trying to see things and see shapes and how they relate. Start with the big shapes, then work down to the smaller shapes and detail that you want to work at. But, you know, to me, the wrong thing to do is to start out painting a doorknob as the first thing in your painting. You know, start looking at the bigger picture, the bigger shapes. Okay, so that's probably enough. That's there. So you want to make sure too, if you pause for any length of time, not just even a couple minutes, that you make sure you cap these things because they do clog up. So that's the kind of the first step that I do in these types of paintings. The next thing is the kind of the splatter that I like to do. So I'll take this, I've soaked it in a little bit of water, soapy water to start. I'm just going to dip it in my jar. You can squeeze it with a bottle, and I rub off the excess. And then I start by pulling it back and splattering it a little bit. And then I tap it to get some larger drops. If I do that tapping right away, I usually get some big, ugly drops that I don't want. And the thing about the masking fluid, once it's dry, you know, just if you got some marks, it's like if I get a big drop on here that I don't want, I don't go and try and clean it off right now. What I do is I let it all dry, and then before I start to paint, I just remove that piece of masking fluid. I don't have to, you don't have to worry about it. You know, you do want to make sure you're in this workspace that you're not going to damage anything. And hard surfaces, just let it dry and then just peel it off. But if it gets in cloth, you're normally in trouble. It doesn't come out of cloth very easily. So, but there, I just splattered a little bit in there, and I have that texture, that pattern. And Got a little bit on the tree. But that's how I prepare before I start to paint. And so that one is going to set aside to dry. And here's one here that I've already put the masking fluid on. It's already dry. It's hard to see. But let me set this over here and rinse out my brush. And if you're ever wondering what materials I use, I have a page on my website, the studio and materials. So at the top, there's a kind of a tour of my space here and what I have around me. And then there's also links to pretty much everything I buy wherever I get it at. So there's this, the masking fluid, the bottles, some stuff I get at Cheap Joe's, some at Dick Blick, some at Amazon. There's a place called the Merry Artist in Oregon, which is they're really good with their delivery. It depends. Another thing, before I start painting that I'm not using it in this, is when I really want a clean edge, if there's something that I like on my cityscapes that I showed you, if there's really an exposed edge that if I paint it back poorly, it's going to show, I'll use this rice tape. It does a nice job of sealing and giving you a clean edge, and it lifts without tearing the paper. It's Nichiban 251 and Nichiban 241, but they do a nice job of sealing. And if you want to mask something off and paint in it with have a nice clean edge, I'll use those tapes. So I'm ready to go ahead and I'm going to start painting. It's going to be a fairly free, loose painting. And show you how these different techniques that I use in my paintings. But if you have questions or anything, feel free to ask them, and I'll do my best to answer them. Let's get my equipment here. As far as what I paint with, I generally feel if you have if I have like a 1-inch flat brush and a 1/2-inch flat brush, a wash brush, I use the Silver Black Velvet. Generally, there's there's synthetic. This is a synthetic blend, Squirrel synthetic blend. This is a totally synthetic Neptune by Princeton. This is a nice brush too, less, not as expensive. But what would I do? But so wash brush, and then a large, this is a quill brush construction. It's a 6, and the size of quill brushes doesn't match, a round brush. This is more like a size 12 or 14 round brush. But a round wash brush, this is another Silver Black Velvet one, which is a nice wash brush. And then I have 3 rounds, normally an 8, a 6, and a 4. That's kind of what I paint with right there. I also have a brush I like to use. That's a quill brush. It's cheap. This is about a $6 or $7 brush from Dynasty. And I use this a lot when I'm doing florals and things. It holds a lot of paint, has a point, and it just moves well. And I use that brush sometimes too. That's kind of what I paint with for the most part. So I'm going to go ahead and start. And I'm going to start with a wash up here. And if you look at the photo, it's kind of bright white there, kind of bright white everywhere. I'm going to tone this area in the back down a little bit. So I'm just going to start with, I use a little bit of cobalt blue. A little raw sienna. And I'm gonna start with a wash back here, just to tone some of this down. got a little bit of paint stuck in my brush. So I'm going to add a little rose madder. Get kind of a violet, kind of a gray violet. A little more raw sienna. You know, when people ask about what colors you're using or what colors you need, to me, the starting point for me is to tell people to be able to, make sure your palette, you can paint the color wheel. Because there's too many manufacturers, there's too many different names used. And and the other thing is, you don't want to become a collector of paint. Everybody's got a bucket of paint that they don't use, and everybody tries to, not everybody, but a lot of people try to worry about getting every tube of paint that an instructor or somebody that they follow is using. And to me, if you can paint the color wheel, that's a good start, because from there you can mix semi-neutrals and neutrals, and so the fact that I use royal blue a lot as a dark color. I don't have any black on my palette. I like to mix my neutrals, but you could use indigo or Danthrone or Delft blue or anything, but I just think too easy to get caught up in trying to collect tubes of paints of everybody you've ever seen. Waste a lot of money. So there, I've kind of toned that down. I left a little bit of the light area in there, and I'm going to. I don't want that red in there. I'm going to come in here, and there's an area of ice here in the back. So I'm going to let's see. I'm going to take a little bit of maybe some cerulean and actually a little cobalt. I want kind of an icy green tone. Actually, that's probably going to work right there. So this has a little bit of raw sienna and a little cobalt blue and some cerulean. And I'm not going to get too crazy with the textures back here. The thing about texture too is you can't just have so much everywhere that it just overtakes the painting. You need to manage the texture, and you want to have resting areas for the viewer to rest their eyes and contrast some of the textures. So don't think every board on a house has to have, you don't have to go crazy with texture and paint the wood grain of every board and every fence and every the log and everything in your scene. You start to go crazy with texture. Kind of an icy green. The thing to remember too, when you're painting winter scenes, the color of ice and the color of snow and the color of water aren't going to be the same. And your snow picks up the ambient light, the violet or the blue on a sunny day, the blue sky. There's light bouncing around. There's warm tones. There's cool tones. So you don't want to just paint it all the same color. Let's see. I'm going to get a little bit more raw sienna in this mixture. Starting to get a little more the feeling of water here and some of the dirt. So I'll come back and I'll add a little bit of a pattern to this. Okay, so I'm gonna pick up, the thing about with a masking fluid, it does trap some of the flow of moisture. Remember, I'm working at an angle, about 20-degree angle, so it starts to flow down and it gets trapped. So I want to pick up some of those pools of moisture before they start backwashing. Because what happens is that moisture's coming down, it's getting drier up here fast before it does here. And eventually, if you leave a pool of moisture, this starts to act like a thirsty paper towel and start to pull it back up. And that's when it starts to move the pigment and create a backwash. So, you always want to pick up, be aware of the moisture in your paper and where it's at. And don't leave yourself open for unwanted backwashes or whatever the case may be. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry this so I can come in. I'm going to put in some kind of gray violets and things for some snow, and I'll start working some of the trees and some of those shapes, some of those rocks. So let me give this a quick dry. Doesn't look like I'm muted. Sorry about that. So I dry this until it's flat. And when it's flat, then I know it's dry. If it still has buckles in it, it's probably not, it's not dry. So I'm going to remove this mostly puddle of water on my palette. Okay, I'm going to take my 1/2-inch flat brush. I'll take a little bit of cobalt blue. A little rose madder. And I'll dip, like, I wanted to mix a violet, so I put cobalt blue here and I wanted some rose madder, but it's hard sometimes to gauge how much you're getting out of there. So that's why I take my brush and deposit some of it here so I know what's on my brush. And then I bring it over to here so I don't overdo with red. And I'm going to take a little bit of raw sienna and just kind of neutralize that a little bit. So it's a 1/2-inch flat brush. And I'm going to come in. And maybe get my, switch my screen around here just a little bit. I have a couple screens in front of me and I'm gonna get the picture here. So there's some, there's some just very light shading on this. So I'm working with kind of a gray violet. And I don't want to overdo the detail or anything on this little piece of snow covered land, because then it's too complicated with all these other textures that I have. Put some shadow. I'm going to do a different round brush. This is a wash brush, and I'm going to use some more cobalt blue. A little too much. So here's again is where I'm using all parts of the brush, the belly, the tip. And I drag it, and I get some a little extra texture in there because of the masking fluid. Creates a little bit of texture. And you want to make sure you're using a big enough brush. You don't want to use a little tiny brush, and make sure it's loaded enough. You get a nice wash. Let the colors kind of mingle on the paper. Okay. So now, I think I'll dry that. I'm going to start painting some of these branches. I'll start with these trees here in the distance. Just kind of keep it very simple, very light, middle value. Put some shadows in there, and I'll start working on some stronger shapes in here. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of raw sienna, some raw umber, a little cerulean blue, mix kind of a semi-neutral, and just using a 1/2 inch flat brush. And blotting it, trying to, just like I was using when I was talking about textures, how I hit it with my hand or blot it with a tissue, just to create a little more variation in the wash. So it's just not, it's not just a flat surface texture or smooth texture. Some of it is, but have a combination of some variation in that going on. And these are just, they're across the river. There's not a lot going on with them. They're just pretty simple shapes. And you don't want to make it like a picket fence. Excuse me. You want to vary where they end, the length of them, the space in between them. You want to, create some variation there. And I'm going to use the same colors pretty much. And I'm going to take some moisture off my brush like I was doing in that exercise, create a broken edge, drag the corner, use the edge, use the belly, and just give the suggestion of some rocks here on the other shore. I'm not going to overdo it with these. So just, kind of a rocky shoreline, a little bit of the ground showing up through the snow. Here I'm painting a little bit more as a wash rather than just a texture. Some shapes here. A couple little rock shapes here. And I'm going to take, this is my 8 round brush. I'm going to mix a kind of a gray violet. Put some shadows here that are cast shadows going up the hill. I still could tone down that area a little bit, and I might do that. So that's kind of the backdrop for starting to get in these stronger shapes in here. And I think I'm gonna dry that and start painting some of these branches and the tree. Okay, and I'll start, right now I'm pretty light on values. I haven't really gotten very dark yet. So let me dry this. I'm gonna start working these branches and the trees and start to get some darker values going. Okay. So I'm going to be working with some raw umber. This is burnt orange. I have both burnt sienna and burnt orange. I like burnt orange. I like the intensity of it. But burnt sienna with ultramarine blue makes a better neutral. So that's why I have both on my palette. Get a little ultramarine blue out there. Use a little bit of that. So warm and cool again. Some raw sienna. And I'll see what I get. So I'm just going to start with, this is a 1/2 inch flat brush. So I kind of skip the belly of the brush just to create the pattern of the edge of the snow. A little bit of that burnt orange in there. I'm making this, the color in this is stronger than what's in the photo. I like to cause interruptions, and I don't like just to do continuous lines that go without interruption. Sometimes when you're painting something, it just looks like you're outlining. A lot of times it's more interesting if you can have a break. The break in this could be the snow laying on it, or just I lifted my brush and there's an interruption, but you don't necessarily have to explain it. The eye will complete visually that make that connection. Doesn't matter that it's not a continuous line. It just looks more interesting if there's some interruptions. I'm going to get a rigger brush. So I repeat a lot of the same kind of marks that I did with the masking fluid. And as I'm doing this, I'm doing warm and cool. I'm doing dark versus light, neutral versus bright, and all those contrasting qualities.
Question, Rick,
Yeah,
from the chat. If you don't have burnt orange, what would you mix to come close?
I'd use burnt sienna. You'd be fine with burnt sienna.
Okay.
I used to just have burnt sienna, but I do like the intensity of the burnt orange. And I took the burnt sienna off my palette and replaced it with burnt orange. But the problem was it doesn't make as nice a neutral with ultramarine blue as burnt sienna does. That's why I put burnt sienna back on my palette. That's why I have both. It's hard to get the intensity of burnt orange. It's kind of a unique color. Quinacridone and burnt orange, it's like quinacridone and gold. They're kind of unique in the pigments, and it's hard to mix unless you have something that's that bright. But burnt sienna works just fine. This has all kinds of little branches coming in from saplings, from briar bushes. Just you can't really see what's at the side. They're just kind of hanging down. And let's see. One of the things about landscapes, it's always good if you can somewhere have a strong horizontal. You can do a painting that's a landscape, and if it doesn't have we like to be able to put our feet on the ground and feel like we can put our feet on the ground. And if you don't have a strong horizontal somewhere, it could be a bridge, it could be a road, it could be the horizon line, it could be a bench somewhere that gives us something we can put our feet on the ground. It just is something more comfortable about it. So if you do paint landscapes and stuff, it's good to have that, and it can sometimes paintings will be very flat and they're hard. There's not a lot of depth in them, and it's hard to get a bearing on what's close, what's middle ground, what's far away, and where's the ground at. And if you give the viewer a clear clue to hey, you can put your feet on the ground here, sometimes it's helpful. So just something to think about. And a couple coming in from the foreground. So all these kind of textures, and I'm going to dry this. I think I'm going to put just a little bit more of a glaze up here, maybe a little darker in here, just a little bit, and I'll keep building my values. Okay, I'm gonna clear this off my palette. And I'll take my wash brush and I'm gonna get a little darker. So some cobalt blue, some ultramarine, maybe a touch of more raw sienna in that. Make it a little darker here.
a long couple questions.
Okay.
First one is, I'm curious why you are putting in the dark branches before the darker value of the river behind it.
Before the darker value of the water behind it?
Yeah,
Because as I put these darker values in, it just struck me that I didn't go dark enough with my wash. I would have liked to put the initial wash in a little darker, but that's why. That's the thing is you start to build your values and you start to position them near other the other values that you start to put in. You start to realize sometimes things aren't quite dark enough, or you want to go darker. But that's why I should have gone a little darker, I think, with the wash initially in here, because I want more contrast. So hopefully that answers that question.
wasn't really planned, it was more like, uh-oh.
Yeah, no, it's just where as you start to see one thing positioned beside the other in the context of the other values and colors of your building, you kind of say, yeah, I'm going to go a little darker with it, but that's the reason. I'm going to give just a little bit of a texture in here of water, a pattern of water.
The other question has to do with the size of the rigger that you're using. And I'm curious, you mentioned a manufacturer, I think, on the rigger, or more of a defined.
So I have 3 rigger brushes. These 2 here are one's a Robert Simmons. These are about 30 years old. These 2. This is a 1. This is a 6. I don't even know if they make them now, but this one gives a nice, consistent, about a 1/16 of an inch line. This one I really like. This is a new one. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite. It's a size 8, but it has a really long, tip, and it has a very sharp point, and it has a nice body, so it holds quite a bit of moisture and give a really fine line. So I'll be using that one eventually. It's a really nice brush. It's a size 8 rigger from Princeton Aqua Elite. These 2, one is Robert Simmons, and I'm not sure what the other one is. They might have both been.
Did you say Aqua Elite?
Yeah, Aqua Elite. And that's what these brushes that I'm using, these round brushes, they're Aqua Elite. They're pretty nice. They hold a point. My 8 is an Escoda. I use it a lot because it has a little more of a blunt point, and this is a Sable. I used to use just these, and their quality went down through the pandemic. I even wrote them, and I had some people from classes who were saying they had trouble with them, and I even wrote them in Spain, and they kind of indicated maybe I should use their synthetic ones because they were having supply chain issues. They start to split at the end a little bit and wouldn't give a nice point, but I like them. The Skoda, they're not cheap, but I like the Aqua Elite line from Princeton. It works really well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. It still feel like could be a little darker there, but we'll go with that. Is that the last of the questions you had for now?
I think so. The other one is a kind of a longer version of the same question.
Okay.
I don't know if Pamela feels like it was answered.
Okay. So I make adjustments as I go and I build my values. It's like here, I feel like I want to go a little darker up here. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to glaze over. I glaze over a lot and tone things down, push things back. I do that a lot on my cityscapes. I'll get towards the end, and one of the last things I'll do is there's areas that I feel are competing for other areas, or the contrast is too strong everywhere, and I'll glaze over and tone an area down. It's the beauty of transparent watercolor. So I'm gonna dry that. I like to go a little darker in here. If I go in here right now, it's damp, and I'm probably gonna get a blossom. So I'm gonna dry it. I might go a little darker here still to get a little more contrast along here. So let me dry this, and I'll do some of that layering.
I bet Amazon will run out of Princeton Aqua Elite 8 riggers.
So I'll do a lot of layering as I build. I generally start with my light values, work to my middle values, and I start with big shapes, light values, go to smaller shapes, middle values, and smallest shapes and darker values. That's generally how I build my my paintings. So I might come back a couple times if I feel like I want to make some more adjustments and glaze. It's a little darker. Or along the lines of where I want to end up. I'm gonna get some a little darker violet. I'm gonna take some ultramarine blue, a little rose madder. And I'm gonna take some quinacridone and gold because that will gray that down quite a bit. Gonna get darker here. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and dry this. I'm gonna take off the masking fluid. And I'll start glazing over those, and then I'll overlap them with some darker shapes.
That's interesting. Interesting sound. that you making that noise?
He's got another speaker someplace that's picking up the sound.
Whoop, sorry about that. Now my
Okay.
button on my mic, sometimes I hit it, it's not muting. I think I wore it out. Sorry about that. So now I'm going to take this pickup eraser and remove the shapes that I have here. The masking tape. And I'm going to glaze over some of these. So now I've got these textures here that are created by the masking fluid. I'm going to take my 8 round brush. I'm going to take some raw sienna and gray it down just a little bit maybe. And some of these I'm going to glaze over because not everything is just snow covered. But it gives me a light shape on top of a dark shape, even if it's just kind of sticks and weeds. And some of them, even if they're snow, they have shadows. So I'll put some kind of gray, gray violets over top of some things. So hopefully you can see a variety of textures and techniques that I've used in here to create some of these textures. I'm going to dry this. I'm going to start bringing in some very dark values in a couple of these spots.
We have a couple more comments. Are you using a heat gun to dry some of the paper? Rick?
Rick, is that a heat gun? No.
Was there a question?
Yeah.
Yes. Is that? Go ahead, Cal. Is that a heat gun?
No, it's not. It's just a hair dryer.
It's red.
I bought it for my workshops because it's supposed to be super quiet, and I thought I'd be able to talk as I was drying my painting. It turns out I paid $80 for what is a very noisy hair dryer. But it has a neat glowing red light on it. But it's just a regular hair dryer.
And does it you ever, when you're using a hair dryer on the masking, make it more difficult to remove? Or
I've never had an issue with it. No, as long as I just try to avoid curing it with a hair dryer because I feel that it can affect the bond. But I never had any really trouble removing the masking fluid. Like I said, that one example where I had left it on for 6 months, still didn't have any problem.
I've heard that it's not a good idea to put it out in the sun.
Yeah. And like I said, you need to have places to rest. You can't just fill the whole page up with this kind of, very active texture. You gotta give some places to rest. And the other thing is, you put these textures down, and I'm going to take this size 8 round brush. You put these textures down with a masking fluid, it doesn't make sense that you take it off and you're like, I've glazed it, but there's no dark shapes overlaying the light shapes, and that doesn't make sense, right? So now I come back and I'm using this 8 rigger, and I start to put some dark shapes over top of these light marks that were just revealed by the masking fluid, because it wouldn't make sense that none of those light shapes have any dark shapes overlapping them. And up in here, there's some dried leaves. Try and pick those shapes up a little bit. And a little bit of that activity over here. Throw a couple over here. And then I like to use that splattering when I was showing in that example. I'll take and tap on my fingers or my back of my hand, create some texture in there. I'll pick up a little bit of some cooler colors too, a little bit of the blue in there. Okay, let me dry that. I'm just going to take a little bit of violet. Get a little darker. So I'm going to go a little more blue in here. Okay, let me dry that. Okay, so that's probably about where I'll stop on that. I could get that in there. So
Just superb. Gee whiz.
when you look at the painting and you look at this, as we've gone through that painting, you know, I did some of this dry brush texture, a little bit of that. I used a lot of the splatter. I didn't use any sponges. I used these linear marks for texture. I didn't really spritz any. I didn't use any of these in the wet surface too much. But I did use some spritzing. I used a lot of splatter. Didn't use any razor. I really didn't scrape, but I used a lot of this with the splatter and the masking fluid and the marks. So a little bit of this. So hopefully you can see how, you know, some of these techniques can be used to apply into the painting. But there's the additive, the subtractive, and then masking are the different techniques that I use when working transparently, you know, to get the textures that I like to do. And that's what I'm saying. And also, what I was saying is kind of simplifying. I'm not trying to render every little branch and everything. I'm not trying to copy with a little brush. I'm just trying to suggest the texture and do my own interpretation of my subject. So that's probably where I'll stop. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah, we have time for questions. Anybody have one? We have one comment that says, beautiful.
Good.
And I have a question. Early in the show, he mentioned rice tape.
Yes.
And then you said something after that, like Nechiban, I don't know.
Yeah, it's Nichiban. That's the manufacturer. Nichiban
okay.
251. It's Nichibon, I believe. And they have different widths, and I use different widths for different things. But it does a really nice job of masking edges. And then also, if you want to lift off something, you want to tape off an area and then scrub it out with like a dry magic eraser or something, it does a good job at doing that too. But it's neat, and you can find it on my page, my material page on my website. There's a link to a few places I buy it. Minnesota. There's a place in Minnesota. There's the St. Louis Art Company. Also the Merry Artist, the one I mentioned in Portland. They all carry that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great page. I've visited that to get the little bottles.
What a wonderful comprehensive lesson this was. Excellent. And I love the way you select and leave things out.
Yeah, I feel you need to edit and simplify. And I think it's one of the toughest things people struggle with. I think, you know, a lot of us work with photos in our homes or our studios, and I think there's this belief that the the photo police or something are going to come get us if we leave something that was in our photo that wasn't in there. But I mean, I modify all the time. I edit, I leave things out, I add things, I stretch things. You know, one of the things that you see a lot is when people are, you know, to me, there's a difference between somebody who's a realist painter and somebody who copies photos. A person can copy photos and be a very good technician and have a very realistic, photorealistic painting, but they copy all the bad design flaws in the photograph. Where a realist, they're going to look very realistic, but they're making adjustments as they're looking in their subject and interpreting them. It looks very photorealistic, but they've eliminated tangents and they put, you know, made things that position things where they should be. You know, if something's not just right, they'll move it. And those are the kind of adjustments you need to make, I feel. That's how I like to paint. I used to do my first watercolor was, I used to do tight pencil drawings. And my first watercolor was with a zero brush on a 10 sheet of an illustration board, painting 10 hours to paint a waterfall scene. And I actually taped in on the 10x7 sheet to make it probably 5x7. I spent 10 hours making it look like a photograph, you know, but then a little over time, I learned how to, you know, a different way to do it. Yeah. So, but I hope you enjoyed that. And again, I appreciate you having me. You know, I can answer any other questions you might have.
I have a request. Can you email me a photograph of the final painting that I could use
Sure.
when I'm sending things out for people to?
Yeah, I'll send you a photo.
Thank you very much.
Very
Thank you.
informative. Wonderful.
Terrific demonstration.
Thank you. Glad
Thank
you
you
enjoyed it.
so much.
Thank you, and I hope you guys dig out soon.
But we have lots of resource material for painting snow now.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, I bet you do. Yeah, I bet you do.
Okay, thank you very much, Rick. I'll see you Thursday, or when will I see you?
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Okay.
Thank you, you
Bye-bye.
too.
Bye-bye.